At the turn of the 16th century, Tenochtitlan, navel of the earth, center of the universe, was the largest metropolis of the Americas and one of the most populated cities in the world. The Aztecs controlled an empire extending over 150,000 square miles, or 200,000 square kilometers, studded with high mountains, deep valleys, deserts, and tropical coastal regions. During this period, goods from every corner of the kingdom poured into the capital. Its citizens worked in the many districts, dedicated to the production of everyday necessities and luxury items made of copper, silver, and gold. Tenochtitlan, as the dominant partner in the Triple Alliance with Tacuba and Texcoco, received the lion's share of tribute. Moctezuma II was only 39 when he became king. He was already both feared and respected for his display of bravery and skill in waging war, alongside his uncle, King Ahuitzotl. Moctezuma lived in the ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan in a palace with several hundred rooms. Only his closest advisors could look at him. His nobles had to wear rough clothing made of agave fiber and keep their backs bent and their eyes to the floor when they approached him. His meals consisted of hundreds of dishes, some of which included the cooked flesh of sacrificed warriors.
My uncle was a respected Pozteca, a merchant and trader who traveled far and wide, but had grown old and decided to retire to his country home. We gathered to celebrate this event. Musicians and performers entertained guests. My uncle gave away most of his possessions on this occasion, keeping only what was necessary for the coming years. It was twilight as I walked out into the garden to smoke my pipe. I saw a woman gazing up at the clouds and singing softly as Tonatiuh, the sun god, crept into the underworld. Not wishing to disturb her, I returned to our guests. When she rejoined the women, I was careful not to let her see that I was admiring her shining hair, her dark eyes, and her smooth amber skin. I learned that she was the daughter of a Pozteca from Texcoco. On our first meeting, several months later, I asked her what she saw in the sky that evening. I saw the fingers of God radiate through the clouds, she said. Time has not dimmed my memory of her grace and beauty.
During his reign, Moctezuma II consolidated power in the hands of the aristocrats and appointed nobles to positions of authority. He expanded his empire, launched punitive raids against recalcitrant territories, and built fortresses along the border of the Tarascan kingdom. The small province of Tlaxcala, completely surrounded by the Aztecs, was held in a vice-like grip. Cotton, salt, and access to food from the Gulf Coast were in short supply. The Aztecs used the Tlaxcalans as bait to train their warriors, the object being to capture as many Tlaxcalan warriors as possible for use as sacrifices. Moctezuma, a highly devout man, was troubled by strange dreams and dark omens. In 1515, a brilliant comet turned night into day. An eagle fell from the sky into the ceremonial center, and a temple inexplicably burst into flames. Large waves from Lake Texcoco surged onto the island, and eerie female voices were heard wailing at night. Then, in 1518, Moctezuma was told that strange floating mountains had been seen off the coast of Mayan territories, far to the south. Spain, forged in a cauldron of wars and conquests. Carthaginians, Greeks, Romans, and Visigoths, each in turn, took advantage of the rich mines and fertile soil of the Iberian Peninsula. In the 7th century, Moors, who were Berber warriors from North Africa, invaded Spain and established Andalusia. It was the beginning of 800 years of Islamic rule. Roman law was abolished, slavery was outlawed, and Jews and Christians were free to practice their faith. Cordoba, the capital of Moorish Spain, was built by Abd al-Rahman I and a succession of caliphs, and became a magnet for mathematicians, philosophers, scientists, and poets. Thousands of books were produced there every year. Of the more than 300 mosques erected in Spain, the Mezquita of Cordoba was the largest in the Muslim world after the Kaaba in Mecca. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Muslim presence on the peninsula began to wane. Crusaders captured Granada, the last bastion of Arab Al-Andalusia. Spain was united under one monarchy and was poised to extend its power and influence. These celebrants in a small town in the province of Extremadura are commemorating their son's victory in a battle fought long ago during one of the many wars with Italy. By wearing white cloaks against a backdrop of snow, the Spanish soldiers had surprised and overcome their enemy. The villagers are thanking their patron saint, Santa Maria, for her protection. Military recruiters forcibly drafted young men from towns throughout Spain. During the long struggle to expulse the Moors and the lengthy wars with Italy, Spanish soldiers had become one of Europe's most battle-hardened forces. In 1485, Hernán Cortés was born in the town of Medellín in the province of Extremadura. His father, Martín Cortés, an infantry captain, and his mother, Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, were hidalgos, or nobles. Though descended from noble families, they lived modestly. Hernán Cortés briefly studied law at the University of Salamanca. After being injured in a fall from a mistress's window, he convalesced in the family home, and much to his parents' dismay, seemed to have no plans for the future, spending days wandering around the shipyards and ports, talking to sailors and merchants, no doubt hearing the many stories about the gold and glory to be had in the rich new lands of the New World. The port of Seville, Spain's gateway to the world. The city, located along the shores of Guadalquivir, was 50 miles from the sea. Seville attracted rich and poor alike, and during its golden age, its population swelled to 60,000. It was the main center for the trade of slaves from Africa. They were sold to buyers from all parts of Europe who gathered in the square in front of the largest cathedral on the continent, La Giralda. In the city center, bonfires were lit to immolate Jews, Protestants, Moors, and blasphemers, condemned by the judges of the Inquisition. Arab caliphs in northern Africa had blocked access to the routes leading to the Orient, with its luxury goods and precious spices. After years of fruitless audiences with the Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish monarchs, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator, finally convinced King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to sponsor his voyages of discovery of new trade routes. Since Seville had been awarded a monopoly on trade, it supplied settlers for the colonies in the Americas.
My father was a pig farmer in a small town near Seville in Spain. As a boy, I spent long hours tending to our hogs, but my passion was horses. I did not follow in my father's footsteps. My grandfather had a fine mare, and he taught me how to pound iron to fashion tools and horseshoes. This knowledge would serve me well. As I approached manhood, my mother and two brothers fell ill and died, as would many others during the Black Death. Shortly before my 17th birthday, I left for Seville. I planned to find work on a ship leaving for the new lands. My only possession was a gold medallion given to me by my grandfather and a letter written by him to Don Antonio Zoria, a pilot on a caravel. The port of Seville was alive with sailors loading cargo onto ships bound for Hispaniola and Cuba. I was hired by Zoria's captain as herrero, or blacksmith, and my job was to care for 6 horses, highly prized cargo destined for a land which had none.
In 1504, 19-year-old Hernán Cortés sailed from Seville to Hispaniola. He worked there for 6 years as a farmer and a notary. He had not come to till the soil, but to search for gold. Then joined Diego Velázquez and a force of 300 men in the conquest of Cuba, for which he was richly rewarded and eventually appointed mayor of Santiago. For over 2,000 years, various indigenous tribes had migrated to the island of Cuba. When the Spaniards reached its shores, Cuba was inhabited by at least 100,000 Arawak and Taíno Indians. Though they put up a fierce fight, most were massacred, and those who had not found refuge in caves were enslaved. Many of them died, thus forcing the Spaniards to import black slaves. Over time, more than 1 million slaves would be brought to Cuba. The fertile soil, temperate climate, and numerous deep-water bays provided the new masters with an ideal launching site from which to explore the unknown regions further west.
In our small community on the coast of Cuba, I labored as a herrero for citizens, merchants, and hidalgos fortunate enough to possess a horse. There were no cattle or sheep. I made a deal with Antonio Zorita to import pigs from my father's farm to help supplement my incomes. But at night, I dreamed of fame and fortune. My escape from servitude came about when Don Pedro Alvarado arrived seeking men to join an expedition led by Hernán Cortés. Juan de Grijalva had been sent to Mexico by the governor of Cuba, Velázquez. The news of Grijalva's discovery of gold and jewels in the Yucatan spread across the island like wildfire. Hernán Cortés, mayor of Santiago, renowned as an excellent horseman and swordman, had been a brave leader during the native insurrection. He was the first to bring cattle to Cuba and his land. Slave and gold mines had made him a wealthy man. Governor Velázquez named him captain of an expeditionary force to explore the Yucatan coast and barter with the natives. He sold all his property and went into debt to outfit his fleet of vessels, and many distinguished hidalgos joined his enterprise, including Cristobal de Olid, Alonso de Avila, and Gonzalo de Sandoval. I joined the expedition and marched to Havana to meet the captain and his armada.
The relationship between Cortés and Diego Velázquez, the governor, was strained. Cortés led a faction of colonists who were unhappy with the distribution of land and slaves. The governor had twice imprisoned Cortés, only to have him escape and seek refuge in a church. However, Cortés's return to the good graces of the governor was sealed when he married Velázquez's sister-in-law, Catalina Juárez. However, doubts and suspicions lingered, and those close to Velázquez did not trust Cortés and persuaded the governor to withdraw his command of the expedition. While Cortés and his men were busy acquiring provisions for the flotilla, a messenger was sent to Havana ordering that Cortés be put in chains. The commander in Havana, an admirer of Cortés, refused and told the governor that if he did so, the hundreds of armed men in his small port town would most likely rebel. Thus, in an act of mutiny, Cortés and 600 men on 11 boats set out from Havana on February 18, 1519, bound for the coast of Yucatan. On reaching the island of Cozumel, Cortés rescued a Spaniard, Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked 8 years earlier and enslaved by Mayan Indians. He proved to be invaluable to Cortés, as he had learned Maya and could act as his interpreter. On the 12th of March, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his men landed on a desolate stretch of beach on the coast of the Aztec Empire. They founded Veracruz, the True Cross, in the name of His Majesty, the King of Spain. The region was inhabited by the descendants of the Totonac Empire. By the time Cortés arrived, the Totonacs had been subdued and their land had become a province of the Aztec nation. In the Totonac capital of Zempoala, the conquistadors, as these conquerors came to be called, formed an alliance with their king, who complained bitterly to the Spaniards about the tribute his people were forced to send to the Aztec sovereign Moctezuma. Cortés assured the Totonac king of his protection, and to cement the alliance, the king gave Cortés 20 women. One of these, Doña Marina, the daughter of a chieftain killed by the Aztecs, became Cortés's mistress and interpreter. With her help and that of the Spaniard Geronimo de Aguilar, Cortés had a vital advantage in his dealings with his newly minted friends and foe.
My marriage with the woman I had so admired in the garden was a joyous event. We looked forward to our lives together, and if the gods were kind, we would be blessed with children. But during this time, a dark cloud had descended upon the land. Rumors of strange men on our shores were confirmed by Pasteca traders my uncle knew well. His spies in Montezuma's court described the arrival of white, bearded men dressed in armor that blazed in the sun, who rode stags and shot thunder and lightning from sticks and black tubes. I spoke little of these matters to my wife, for fear of alarming her, but as the daughter of a Pasteca, she was clearly well informed. She spoke of emissaries being sent, bearing gifts made of finely crafted gold and silver, as tokens of friendship to those they believed to be Quetzalcoatl and his disciples. My uncle believed they were impostors, and that the king should rally his men and destroy them.
Several of Montezuma's emissaries arrived, richly dressed, their ears and noses pierced with large gold discs and rods. We learned that the emissaries wanted us to return to our homes. Speaking through his interpreters, Cortés told them he was the subject of a powerful monarch beyond the seas, who ruled an empire and had kings and princes as his vassals. He told the emissaries that it was his duty as envoy of our king to meet the great Montezuma and pay his respects. To impress them, he ordered a display by our cavalry and had a cannonball fired into a tree, shredding it to pieces. There were men, allies of Velázquez, who conspired against Cortés and shrank in the face of the hardship and dangers of our expedition. Those close to Cortés counseled that he burn our ships before our departure from the coast, and he ordered secretly that this should be done. While some were shaken by the destruction of our fleet, our hearts were lifted by the promise of our El Dorado. We had to succeed or perish, and so we began our march to Tlaxcala.
Cortés and his small band of soldiers trekked from the lush tropical coast with its suffocating heat and ascended gradually into the cooler, rugged mountains of the Sierra Madre. They were accompanied by 1,300 warriors from Zempoala and 1,000 porters who carried provisions and hauled the cannons. Marching in battle array, Cortés led the cavalry and light troops. Cold winds, rain, and hail swept down from the mountains and chilled them to the bone. The Tlaxcalan chiefs were divided on how to treat these strangers advancing toward their frontier. Some advocated cooperation, while others believed that they were vassals of Moctezuma, the Aztec king. Finally, several thousand Tlaxcalan warriors attacked the Spaniards, and a fierce battle ensued. The Indians discharged volleys of arrows and stones, while Cortés and his men cut them down with swords, muskets, and crossbows, forcing the Tlaxcalans to retreat. A few days later, the conquistadors faced 20,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. As war cries rang out and drums pounded, darts, stones, and arrows fell like an avalanche upon the Spaniards. They had never faced such a determined foe. Tlaxcalans, unafraid of the mounted cavalry, tore and slashed at the riders, trying to drag them off their steeds. Spanish artillery mowed down scores of Indians who began to give ground. Many were trampled under the hooves of the disciplined cavalrymen, their Toledo steel swords and axes gleaming in the sun. Cortés released the Indians taken as prisoners and sent envoys to sue for peace, but to no avail. After the Spaniards crushed a secret night attack under a full moon, the Tlaxcalans were finally routed.
We had suffered greatly. 50 men were killed, and every survivor was wounded. I worked constantly to repair our weapons and used the boiled fat of dead Indians to heal the gashes on our horses' flanks. The Tlaxcalans sent envoys to arrange for peace. Their great chief, Zicotancatl, entered our camp. His battle-hardened face showed wisdom well beyond his 35 years. He took all blame for the hostilities, believing that the strangers were vassals of Montezuma, and he presented Cortés with gift and apologized for their lowly value, explaining that his people were poor and that his small nation was being crushed by the mighty Aztec Empire. Some advisors counseled Cortés to retreat. During our journey from Cozumel to Veracruz, we had met fierce resistance every time we landed to seek provisions. The ferocity of the Tlaxcalan and our reduced circumstances had cast a pall over the Spaniard. What chance did they stand against Montezuma's large army? Cortés spoke to us, telling us that we had suffered greatly but had triumphed against great odds and were protected by God. He told us we could not retreat because our new friends would become our enemies. That is how the Tlaxcalan became our staunchest allies.
Moctezuma heard about the Spaniards' march into Tlaxcalan territory and believed that these interlopers would be slaughtered. With each Spanish victory, Moctezuma's anxiety grew. He sent ambassadors to meet Cortés and congratulate him. A Spanish helmet which had been sent as a gift to Moctezuma was returned filled with gold dust. They explained to Cortés that their king could not guarantee him safe passage to their capital. Cortés told the ambassadors that being so close and not paying his respects to Moctezuma would be frowned upon by his king. The city of Cholula, the holiest site in the Aztec realm, lay 60 miles from Tenochtitlan. With its 365 temples and Great Pyramid, one of the largest constructions in the world, Cholula drew worshippers from all corners of the empire. The conquistadors were welcomed into the city. Cortés's interpreter, Doña Marina, was befriended by the wife of a Cholulan noble. Through her, she learned of an attack ordered by Moctezuma. So he and his men launched a preemptive strike against hundreds of chiefs who had all gathered in the main courtyard and slaughtered them all. Their homes and temples were torched, and Tlaxcalan allies poured into the city. The destruction consumed Cholula for 3 days and nights.
The hostilities at Cholula and Montezuma's treachery had confirmed my suspicions that he would order an attack. As we marched towards the capital, we were unopposed and kindly received by the inhabitants of the hamlets and towns where we halted to rest. On the 8th of November 1519, we arrived on the shore of a lake called Texcoco. Montezuma's emissaries arrived to greet us and lead our party into the city. As we marched over a long bridge, we saw hundreds of canoes crisscrossing the waterways. Broad canals bisected floating gardens. The size and splendor of this island city shook me to the core. Was this to be my final resting place? The temples and pyramids reflecting the early morning sun dazzled us. Citizens crowding on rooftop and massed along the avenues viewed our arrivals, while women and children in brightly colored clothing held flower out to us. The men gawked at us, and a murmur arose as our Negroes and cavalry passed. My sense of unease gave way to guarded confidence.
I could smell their arrival before I could see them. My wife stood at my side on our rooftop. It seemed that the whole city wanted to view these strangers, the white gods, vassals of Quetzalcoatl. They had swept through our lands like a fire, scorching everything in their path. After the carnage at Cholula, Montezuma had held a council of nobles. His brother advised him to treat the invaders as enemies, while others, led by Montezuma's nephew, proposed to greet them as friends. After having listened to the various opinions, Montezuma appealed to our nobles to greet the invaders as friends. He argued that if war were declared, the most vulnerable of citizens, the elders, the women, and children would suffer greatly. As I watched the procession unfold, worry for my wife and the future of our city descended upon me like a dark cloud. These warriors and their powerful weapons had slaughtered all who opposed them. The words of my uncle, that these men were impostors, rang in my head.
Moctezuma, carried on a litter of gold and silver, and proceeded by hundreds of nobles and emissaries, approached Cortés and his men. His cloak was fringed with jewels, and his sandals were made of gold. As he descended from his litter and walked amongst his subjects, they bowed and averted their gaze. Moctezuma welcomed Cortés to the capital. The Spaniard offered the king a necklace of colored crystals, but as he approached to embrace him, Moctezuma's attendants blocked his path Cortés told Moctezuma that he had nothing to fear. Moctezuma ordered that the Spaniards be housed in his father's palace and provided with whatever they required. Cortés asked permission to tour the capital. He and his men were shown the public buildings, the aviary and zoo, and the great market, as well as the temples with their gruesome display of skulls. Their visits allowed them to acquaint themselves with the capital's topography, its resources, and the location of its silver and gold mines.
Much time passed. The foreigners often walked among the market stalls, and we merchants greeted them as honored guests of our revered king. At night, these men fired their weapons, creating thunderous bolts of lightning and acrid smoke that wafted over our homes. I did my best to hide my uneasiness from my wife, but I saw the worry in her eyes. When I learned that our king had been taken prisoner in his palace, my heart sank. All pretense of friendship with these men evaporated.
I do not know when our captain decided to take Montezuma prisoner, but it helped us control the natives and discover the treasure in the city. Montezuma himself led the captain to 2 storehouses filled with gold, silver, and jewels. A single dish, the height of a man, was made of solid gold and represented their son. My admiration for the quality and workmanship of these objects was tempered by my ceaseless work reducing them into ingots. I met the king several times when he visited our cavalry and answered his many questions about our horses. Montezuma was tall and pale-skinned compared to his kinsmen. I felt sad for this captive king. His royal demeanor masked his humiliation and reduced circumstances. Several other Spaniards also admired and respected this king. But then the news of boats landing on the shores of Veracruz and of a large force led by Panfilo de Nervez, sent by Velázquez to arrest our captain, obliged us to split our forces in 2. I followed Cortés and 130 men to the coast while Pedro de Alvarado was left in charge of our forces in the capital.
Moctezuma gave the citizens of Tenochtitlan permission to celebrate with the revered snake dance, to which Pedro de Alvarado agreed as long as they were unarmed. Thousands of warriors, women, and nobles paraded past the pyramids, performing this ritual dance. But fearing an attack, Alvarado rashly ordered his men to massacre the celebrants. Panic gripped the crowds as muskets and cannonballs tore into the tightly packed groups, and those who tried to escape by climbing the walls of the sacred precinct were killed. The carnage so enraged the inhabitants of the city, they surrounded the Spaniards, who were forced to barricade themselves in Moctezuma's palace. From a rooftop, Moctezuma pleaded with his countrymen for calm. Shouts of "traitor" were followed by a volley of stones. Whether hit by projectiles or stabbed in the back by his captors, Moctezuma was now of little value, and his body was thrown onto the street below, in front of his palace.
No one was allowed to approach the palace. Our warriors surrounded the Spaniards and cut off their food and water. Neswapili, a respected seer and son of the king of Texcoco, had prophesied that Montezuma would be the last king. And so it came to pass. The intruders had entered our city, bearing a message of peace from their sovereign, but they had only brought death. The return of Cortés filled me with dread.
We had ambushed Nervez and his men in a lightning raid, and once we had captured the leaders, our compatriots capitulated. As the story of our exploit and the treasures to be found in the capital unfold, they quickly joined our forces. We were well provisioned with gunpowder, cannon shot, musket, and fresh cavalry as we marched to the capital. We fought our way to the center, where we found Pedro de Alvarado and his men starving. Surrounded by hostile forces, our captain hatched a plan for our escape at night. We built ladders to cross the causeway, as the drawbridges had been removed. In the dark and in the rain, we fought our way across the lake. It was a terrible night. Warriors in canoes fired arrows and killed many men. They leapt on us as we jumped into the water, man stepping on man, the horses pummeling those unfortunates scrambling for their lives in the black muck. Many perished under the weight of the gold they carried and refused to abandon. I carried no booty and saved myself by jumping on a horse that had lost its rider.
More than half the conquistadors were killed that night, and all the survivors had been wounded. Cortés and his ragged band retreated to Tlaxcalan territory to nurse their wounds and send for reinforcements. The failure to send a large force to attack the fleeing Spaniards and their custom of capturing warriors for sacrifice would prove to be fatal to the Aztecs. 200 Spaniards with fresh horses and ammunition joined Cortés on his march to Tenochtitlan, accompanied by 3,000 Sempoalan allies and 40,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. The invaders built ships to cut off the island from its water routes and destroyed the aqueducts. The siege of the city lasted several months. Many citizens died of starvation or of the plague transmitted by infected soldiers. Cortés sued for peace, but the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan chose to fight on. Cortés and his men aimed artillery at the buildings and blew them to pieces, street by street. No one surrendered. In the breaches, crossbowmen and musketeers fired volleys, and pitched battles ensued. The attacks went on day and night as fires raged across the city. Tlaxcalan allies herded several thousand women and children and drove them into the lake to drown. 2/3 of the city was destroyed. Its temples, pyramids, and palaces lay in ruins, its inhabitants entombed in its island grave. Tenochtitlan, capital of the mighty Aztec Empire, was no more. On the 13th of August, 1521, 3 years after having landed on its shores, the Spanish conquistadors claimed these new lands in the name of their Catholic sovereigns.
The determination of the Aztecs to resist us compelled our commander to destroy the capital, but our victory was bittersweet. Death was everywhere. I could not walk without stepping on the dead. We had been welcomed to their capital and treated as friends, but we now buried their people in the dust. The dead haunts my dreams. The events I witnessed are seared into my soul and cannot be undone.
Our time was drawing to a close. A pestilence that ravaged our people took my wife. The glow of life in her eyes was dimmed by the shadow of death. We believed that the sun was our father and the earth was our mother. We had our own customs and beliefs. We lived in a flourishing city, but they burned our books, trampled our gods, and smashed our temples. The eagle of our nation had soared to great heights, only to be shot down. In my healing, I forgave those who brought such great destruction, but I will never forget.